Let's give a round of applause to the Knight Foundation for everything that they do in Miami and across the United States, and not to mention the work you do in journalism, Alberto, as well, which is another area of importance. And thank you to our musicians, Emma and Patrick, again. I'm Sean McManus, the co-founder of the Arts Funders Forum and co-founder of M+D, which designs platforms to drive social impact, such as this one. Thank you so much for joining us today to talk about the future of cultural philanthropy. The idea for AFF started about 2 years ago, around the time that President Trump was proposing to eliminate funding for the National Endowment for the Arts. Although thankfully this did not happen, it did get us thinking. So one afternoon in Miami, a group of us were asking ourselves the question, what would this actually look like? What would it mean if private donors had to fill the void of the NEA? So we started looking more closely into the data on arts funding and where the trends were heading. And it was worrisome. Then we started to connect the dots to the moment we're living in relative to the amount of wealth that is being transferred to new generations of philanthropists. And we realized there was a massive problem that needed to be solved, but also a massive opportunity to solve it. We met with the Knight Foundation, which embraced the idea of developing a new platform to bring together arts funders from across the US to begin to reimagine the future of cultural philanthropy. And this was well before cultural institutions started returning millions of dollars in dirty money, which added an entirely new level of urgency to our mission. So we knew we were onto something, but we knew that our first step was to learn more and to start talking in depth to people like you, people who are deeply invested in the arts, to ask you what you thought about the future of cultural philanthropy. So this is what we did. We looked at the boards of trustees of cultural institutions across the US and built a database of 5,000 arts funders and benefactors with a special attention on the rising generation of donors. We included heads of cultural institutions, artists, experts, influencers, authors, academics, curators, gallerists, specialists. We wanted a 360-degree look at the cultural sector. We launched surveys and set up phone and in-person interviews to dig into the areas of great concern to the cultural community. We asked about the state of arts funding, new models for giving, and the challenges and opportunities facing the sector. And finally, we analyzed this data and used it to design a new platform to shape the future of cultural philanthropy. And this was very much a national effort. You can see here a few of the institutions that we approached at the board level from across the United States, both big and small. And we ended up with about 500 respondents. This is an engaged community of arts funders from across demographics that engaged with us and helped us to inform the future of arts funding. And this is what we learned. The first piece of data was deeply validating and, of course, also highly concerning, which is that 78% of those surveyed were very concerned or somewhat concerned about the current state of cultural philanthropy. Cultural philanthropists see a need for more robust partnerships. Young philanthropists want the arts to drive social change. Institutions need to better understand next-generation funding behaviors, and this is incredibly important. Our research showed that that most people who responded to our survey indicated that trends in giving are drastically different from this generation to the next. There's also a deep need for different investment vehicles. This might mean public-private or even for-profit cultural institution models. And that younger philanthropists want funding to be much more technology-driven, and we'll hear a lot more about that later this afternoon. And another piece of data that we knew but was validated is that cultural institutions need to do a better job of expressing their value. In short, cultural institutions are struggling with an existential crisis to stay relevant. And for us, this determined our thesis, which is that there is a need for a new platform to bring together cultural philanthropists and leading thinkers from across the arts to reimagine the future of arts funding. Together, we hope that Arts Funders Forum will shepherd and kickstart a golden age of cultural philanthropy. This research would not have been possible without our AFF founding delegates, many of whom are here today. This is the community that took time to engage with us during our research phase to help us identify the trends and issues that will inform the future of arts funding, and I want to give them a round of applause. Thank you so much for the time you spent with us. But one of the most critical issues that we must confront is the rising generation of philanthropists who are not engaging with us. What was confirmed in our research is that many tech founders and younger donors do not have the same appreciation for the arts as previous generations of funders. This is one of the big problems that we need to solve together, and it's one of the reasons that we are here today. I just want to take 1 second to acknowledge the AFF team that made this all possible. My business partner, the co-founder of AFF and co-founder of M+D, Brett Dobbs, who's here from Los Angeles. The person many of you know who is the driving force behind this initiative for the past 2 years, the director of AFF, Melissa Cowley-Wolf, a writer and activist for the arts who is also a physician in his spare time. Akash Goel could not be here today. Jennifer Joy and her team at Sutton in New York, which was responsible for expanding the AFF brand and so effectively developing the community that is assembled here. My colleague Samantha Keel, who was instrumental in every aspect of organizing this launch event. And last but not least, my wife Spring, who is a brilliant art advisor, advocate for the arts, and continues to shape the vision of what AFF can become. Thank you so much to this amazing team. We have an incredible lineup of speakers today. As Alberto mentioned, this is a fast-paced program. Thank you so much for being here. I'm so excited to start the conversations with the guy whose research we relied on to kickstart this initiative, the president and CEO of Grantmakers in the Arts, Eddie Torres. I'd like to welcome Eddie to the stage. So Eddie, I think some of the people in this room know that you produce a significant report every year,
right,
which lays out kind of the landscape of arts funding.
Yeah.
So why don't we start with the initial thesis that we had and we launched from, and that was largely based on research that you had produced based on both public and private funding. So tell us a little bit about the landscape of public funding for the arts in the United States today.
Certainly. Well, at Grantmakers in the Arts, we actually employ a lobbyist on DC, a lobbying firm specifically to get the arts into pieces of legislation where you wouldn't expect to see the arts, like, let's say, the Older Americans Act or the Child Care for Working Families Act. And this is for a specific reason, because public funding for the arts has been declining so much lately. The fact of the matter is we believe that the arts should be a part of every public agency's budget, not just the arts agencies. So we're seeing the state arts agencies' budgets declining pretty precipitously, largely in keeping with tax revenue. Local arts agencies, not as bad, but still down. We've been seeing this recent phenomenon over the past couple of years where the NEA's budget has actually been rising fairly sharply, which is fantastic. But also keep in mind the historic context. We're seeing that happen after it had been so hobbled by the culture wars of the mid-1990s, you know? So while we're seeing this rise recently, it's small in comparison to the hit it took a while back. And keep in mind, the culture wars were effective the way they were because essentially it was an attack on public spending that targeted artists. It wasn't targeting necessarily, to some extent it was targeting institutions, but it was targeting artists and demonizing what were essentially women, members of the LGBT community, and artists of color, first of all. Second of all, they also did a really, these are mostly anti-tax advocates, did a really good job of basically framing the arts as kind of a playground for the rich. The fact of the matter is, study after study has shown that the arts are essential to a healthy community, to a community that has strong physical health, mental health, has strong educational outcomes, that has strong civic engagement, that has strong safety. And we really haven't told that story sufficiently. That's why we want to make sure the arts are a part of every public agency's budget.
Eddie, so let's, I was talking to Robert Lynch for Americans for the Arts last night at the Young Arts Dinner, and we were talking about the role that cities play.
Yeah.
So there's federal funding, which we've touched on. There's also city funding, which I think is a more optimistic story. You actually spent time in city government working in the arts. So tell us a little bit about the role of local funding.
Sure. Before this, I was a deputy commissioner for New York City, and you know, we were in a very unique position. New York City has been supporting the arts since the late 1800s. And essentially, we were doing what a lot of public agencies and foundations were doing, which was basically taking our cue from the individual donor community. Around the 1800s, individual donors really began the field of cultural philanthropy. They were doing a specific thing at a specific time. They were trying to put their city on the world map for the first time in our country's history. One. They were also trying to put themselves on the world map for the first time in history. The idea of the newly rich was a new idea. I mean, wealth had been generational prior to that. This had some unintended consequences that continue to reverberate to this day, largely manifest in money getting tied up in ways that don't necessarily increase liquidity, you know? So facilities, endowments, things like that. That can be very, very constricting, even for well-resourced organizations. An organization that's well-resourced isn't necessarily well-capitalized. They don't have the savings to withstand the volatility of the philanthropic market. That's why we had a big focus on making sure that we gave unlimited overhead so that if they just needed it to pay their back office staff, fine, fantastic. And also actually support artists.
So what about private giving? So which is why we're here today and the purpose of AFF, which is to inspire more private giving to the arts. What is the current landscape for private giving to the arts given the overall pie of philanthropic giving, and where are the trends heading?
So, I mean, in terms of foundation giving, what we've been seeing over the past couple of decades has been, well, specifically since the recovery of, you know, the start of the recovery from the Great Recession, we've been seeing foundation giving to the arts increasing, but it's actually declining as a percentage of foundation giving, period. That is to say, other parts of foundation giving are just growing faster than the arts are, right? I think this, from what the evidence shows us, this looks like it largely has to do with whether the arts are perceived as having social impact. Again, you know, when we do an annual conference every year. I guess that's why it's annual, right? It's every year. So we did ours a couple of weeks ago. We had over 600 people show up to hear Aggie Gund talk about the role of the arts in criminal justice reform. These were people who had an appetite to hear about the social impact of the arts. When it comes to individual giving, we're seeing this past year, literally this year, for the first time since the beginning of the recovery from the Great Recession, individual giving decline. Mm-hmm. This is right in keeping with the Tax Cuts Act, which has doubled the standard deduction for charitable giving. This is the first time in a long time we're seeing this, with individual giving to the arts is flat. This is extremely disconcerting. Anything that discourages charitable giving is harmful to the arts.
So we heard from Alberto about the work that the Knight Foundation is doing. You actually spent time at the Ford Foundation and the Rockefeller Foundation. We know that Bloomberg Philanthropies is doing incredible work in the arts in New York, and we'll see how that plays with the head of that organization who wants to be the president. But what would you say you learned from your time in foundations? Where are things moving now, and what role are they evolving to play in this space?
Yeah, I think ultimately in foundations, and it's not exclusively in foundations that I see this phenomenon, I see a lot of folks who are not in the arts who have a real appetite to engage the arts. What they don't feel like they have is expertise. They don't feel like they have the knowledge and the comfort. And look, trust basically happens over time. You can't delegate it, you can't accelerate it, you just need to take the time. I also have come to I hope I'm seeing more support for advocacy and lobbying. The fact of the matter is, both at a foundation and at a public agency, I've seen the impact that it can have, and a lot of foundations don't realize they can actually support not just, they can engage in advocacy, they can support advocacy, they actually can support lobbying, you know? Our lobbying gets supported by a mixture of individual donors and foundations. It's completely legal. Just keep it under, 5% of your activities and 20% of your budget.
So your message to these guys is, look, be advocates, fight for policy.
In every sense, I think we should be advocates, yes, but I think we should also not be timid. I think it needs to be treated as essential, the same way we treat health.
What is your interpretation of the next generation of arts funders? How are younger donors different from their parents, and what's driving them, and what do we need to do to inspire them?
Well, I think that a lot of folks who are showing a lot of evidence for desire for social impact are looking at these things very literally and not necessarily ecologically. The fact of the matter is, I think the amount of money that's going into health is beautiful and inspiring. I think that health is being treated just as treatment. And that doesn't need to be exclusively the case. The fact of the matter is that most of our health comes from our lifelong wellness. And the correlation between arts engagement and lifelong wellness is considerable. It's not just coming from arts advocates. It's coming from Johns Hopkins University. It's coming from University of Pennsylvania. These are not necessarily arts advocates. These are health advocates who are seeing the correlation between arts engagement and health.
Amazing. So if you are suggesting that we all need to be lobbyists, that we all need to become inspired to petition policy, what would be your number one policy change that would improve both public and private support for the arts?
I mean, anything that makes giving easier. You know what I mean? Right now, the doubling of the standard deduction, I think, is having adverse consequences, perhaps unintended consequences, but adverse nonetheless, one. And then two, the storytelling that we do about the arts, you know? Our inheriting arts giving patterns from the 1800s, I think, had a lot of good impacts and a lot of unintended bad impacts. And the fact of the matter is, when I see young people now, they're still seeing those inherited activities as stodgy and stale, and we don't need to continue to reiterate the 1800s. We can make the future that we want to see, we can make it ourselves, and we can make it now.
Beautiful. Eddie, thank you so much. It is my pleasure to welcome, I think, one of the most articulate advocates for the role that the arts plays in society, who's a curator who wears many hats in the art world, Diana Haggag, to the stage.
Fantastic, thank you.